Last week, a county fairground in Arkansas filled with anxious faces. Farmers, weathered hands, worn boots, eyes that had seen decades of seasons, sat shoulder to shoulder in a makeshift auditorium. They weren't there for a harvest celebration. They came to Congress with one plea: save us. The numbers tell a grim story: mounting debt, equipment so aged it barely turns over, profit margins that have evaporated. For hundreds of agricultural families across America's heartland, survival isn't a question of expansion or growth anymore. It's simply about breaking even. Some days, even that feels impossible. But here's what makes this moment different. This crisis didn't arrive quietly. It didn't sneak up through natural causes. No drought, no flood, no disease that swept through cattle herds. This was engineered, built brick by brick through policy choices, trade wars, and decisions made in distant boardrooms. And just when rural America thought someone in Washington might finally listen, might finally extend a hand of relief, something shocking happened. The President of the United States approved a stunning $20 billion financial package for Argentina. $20 billion. Not to rebuild American grain elevators, not to support farmers teetering on the edge of losing everything, not to stabilize the families who grow the food that feeds this nation. The money went south, all the way to Buenos Aires, thousands of miles away, to prop up a government and its economic experiment. Meanwhile, in Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas, the phones in farm kitchens are ringing with bad news from the bank. This isn't just a story about money or markets, or even trade policy. This is about broken promises. It's about a leader who stood in front of rural crowds, who looked farmers in the eye, who swore on his word that he would fight for them, that he would never forget where he came from, that American agriculture would always come first. And now, in their darkest hour, those same farmers are watching that promise crumble into dust. To understand what's happening right now, you need to see the full scope of the crisis unfolding across rural America. A dairy farmer in Wisconsin decides to sell his herd. After 40 years of milking cows at 4 in the morning, after building a reputation for quality, after raising his children on that farm, he walks away. Why? The economics don't work anymore. Milk prices have plummeted. Operating costs have skyrocketed. The gap between what it costs to produce and what buyers will pay has become impossible to bridge. Across the country, scenes like this are multiplying. Dairy farms are closing at the fastest rate in decades. The cooperative networks that once gave small producers a voice and a foothold in the market are shrinking. Without them, individual farmers have almost no negotiating power. They take what they can get, or they get nothing at all. But dairy is just one piece of the puzzle. The real crisis is in grain. For over a generation, American soybean farmers have relied on one customer above all others: China. This wasn't a casual relationship. China was the world's largest buyer of American soybeans, consuming tens of millions of tons annually. That steady demand created a reliable market. Farmers knew roughly what their crops would be worth. Banks knew farmers could repay loans. The system had stability. Then everything changed. When trade tensions escalated and tariffs began climbing, reaching as high as 145% on Chinese goods, Beijing didn't hesitate to retaliate. China stopped buying American soybeans, not reduced orders, not shifted to other suppliers, stopped completely. And here's where the story becomes almost unimaginable. Since May of 2025, not a single bushel of American soybeans has reached Chinese ports. Zero. In the entire modern history of U.S.-China agricultural trade, this has never happened before. It's not a bad year. It's not a temporary disruption. It's a structural break in the system that farmers built their entire lives around. Think about that for a moment. Imagine running a business for 30 years. Your biggest customer represents 40, 50, maybe 60% of your revenue. Then one day, that customer disappears. The door slams shut. Your warehouses are full. Your inventory keeps growing, and the market price keeps dropping because the world knows supply has nowhere to go. That's the reality for soybean farmers right now. Storage facilities that were designed to hold grain for a season are now packed with crops from the previous season. Silos are overflowing, elevators are full, and farmers with no place to put their harvest face impossible choices: store it at increasing cost, sell it at ruinous prices, or simply let it sit. Some grain is rotting, some is being used for animal feed at a fraction of its value. Whatever the outcome, farmers are losing money on every bushel. The statistics paint a picture of economic devastation. Hard red winter wheat, a staple of American agriculture, is trading at prices that haven't been seen in years. Not for poor quality, not during times of global shortage, just because nobody's buying and everybody's selling. Meanwhile, the costs of running a farm keep climbing. Fertilizer, which comes partly from imports, has become more expensive due to tariffs. Tractors and replacement parts, many sourced from overseas suppliers, now carry tariff surcharges. Even seeds and chemicals have seen prices rise. A farmer trying to stretch every dollar, already operating on razor-thin margins, now faces equipment invoices that are 20, 30, sometimes 40% higher than they were just a year ago. One Iowa farmer summed it up starkly. Because of the trade situation and the tariffs, many of our customers have told us flat out, "We're not buying American anymore. We're getting our commodities from somewhere else." So the prices we're seeing, especially on winter wheat varieties, have hit rock bottom. It feels like we're watching a market just disappear. He's not exaggerating, and he's not alone. When you add it all up, income collapsing on one side, expenses rising on the other, farmers face a crushing squeeze. Loans that came due in better years now feel impossible to repay. Bankers, dealing with their own pressures, are asking harder questions. What was once routine financing becomes fraud. Some farmers are being asked to refinance at higher rates. Others are receiving notices that certain credit lines are being tightened or closed. The human toll is staggering. Family farms that have passed through multiple generations, from grandparent to parent to child, are now at risk of being lost to foreclosure. Some families are wrestling with the decision to sell land that represents not just property, but heritage, history, and identity. For many rural families, the farm is who they are. The thought of losing it is the thought of losing themselves. Before all this happened, there was hope. Farmers remembered Trump's campaign promises. They recalled his rallies, where he stood before crowds and declared war on unfair trade deals, on countries that he said were cheating America. He promised to fight for them. He positioned himself as the champion of rural America, the one who understood that globalization had hurt people in the Heartland, that free trade agreements benefited Wall Street and big corporations while leaving farmers behind. That message resonated. Farmers, like many rural Americans, felt ignored by previous administrations. They felt like their concerns weren't taken seriously, like their way of life was being sacrificed on the altar of abstract economic theory and international relations. So when someone promised to finally put them first, to stand up to China, to renegotiate bad deals, they listened, they voted, they believed. Many of these farmers became passionate supporters. They went to rallies. They encouraged their neighbors to vote the same way. They made a bet that this leader would deliver, that he would be different, that he wouldn't abandon them like, they felt, previous leaders had. For a while, that seemed to be happening. Trump spoke about their struggles. He acknowledged that tariffs might hurt them temporarily, but argued it was necessary. He suggested that the tariff revenues would be used to support farmers until the trade war bore fruit and new markets opened. It would be painful, yes, but temporary, and farmers would come out stronger on the other side. But months have passed now, and the promised support hasn't materialized in any meaningful way. Aid programs that were supposed to provide relief have been tangled in bureaucratic delays. Applications are still pending. Some have been rejected without clear explanation. Farmers who were told to wait for help, to be patient, that relief was coming, they're still waiting. But creditors don't wait. Banks don't wait. Loan payments come due whether help arrives or not. Making matters worse, support structures that existed before have been dismantled. Earlier this year, the Department of Agriculture terminated the Regional Food Business Centers program. On the surface, that might sound like just another government program being cut. But for smaller farms, it was a lifeline. These centers helped farmers build networks, understand market dynamics, and compete more effectively against larger operations. Without that support, small family farms are increasingly isolated. They're left to compete alone against agricultural corporations with deep pockets, sophisticated marketing departments, and relationships with major buyers. It's not a fair fight, and every month that passes, the gap widens. The sense of betrayal among farmers is profound. This isn't just anger about prices or markets, it's something deeper. It's the heartbreak that comes from believing in someone, investing faith in their promises, only to watch those promises dissolve when you need them most. A farmer from Nebraska expressed it this way: "We were told he was our champion. We believed that. We voted for him. We told our families and friends to vote for him. And now, when we're struggling like never before, he's not there. It feels like we were used, like he took our votes and our support, and now he's moved on to bigger things, forgotten where he came from." That's not political rhetoric. That's the voice of someone experiencing what feels like a personal betrayal. Across the Farm Belt, similar conversations are happening. In diners before dawn, in equipment shops, at church, in living rooms, farmers are talking about this. They're angry. They're disappointed. Many are heartbroken. The trust that was built has been broken. The Argentina pivot. Billions. For whom? While American farmers are left begging for help, the White House's attention has turned elsewhere, to Argentina. In a move that, well, raised eyebrows among policy watchers, the U.S. Treasury announced support for Argentina through multiple channels, currency swap lines, bond purchases, and direct financial assistance. The total commitment? Up to $20 billion. To understand why this is happening, you need to know what Argentina is going through. A few years ago, Argentina elected a new president, Javier Milei. He came into office with a radical vision. He positioned himself as a libertarian, someone who idolized figures like Elon Musk, and believed that the answer to Argentina's problems was dramatic deregulation, privatization, and a ruthless commitment to cutting government spending. When Milei took office, he didn't ease into the job. He moved decisively. Within months, hundreds of thousands of civil service workers were laid off. Entire subsidy programs were eliminated. Government ministries were cut drastically. Universities lost funding. Social programs that people depended on were slashed or eliminated. The theory behind these moves was simple. Argentina's government was too big, too expensive, and too prone to deficit spending. If you cut deep enough, fast enough, you could stabilize the economy, restore investor confidence, and create room for private enterprise to flourish. And initially, there were signs it was working. Inflation, which had been running rampant, began to cool. Monthly inflation rates dropped from double digits to around 2.2% by early 2025. On paper, it looked like a success, but underneath those numbers was a human catastrophe. Poverty rates exploded. By early 2024, over half of Argentines were living below the poverty line. By 2025, that situation hadn't improved. More than half the country was struggling to feed their families, pay rent, or access basic services. Unemployment spiked. Wages stagnated even as the cost of living remained high. For millions of Argentines, the promise of a better future gave way to the reality of a far more desperate present. The austerity had worked to control inflation, but the price was paid by ordinary people. Eroded purchasing power, decimated social safety nets, and a growing sense of desperation. Then Argentina's government made another bold move. It partially dismantled currency controls. For years, Argentina had tightly regulated access to foreign currency. The peso was controlled through strict SIPO rules, which essentially limited how much foreign exchange Argentines could buy and kept the exchange rate artificially stable. This system had its own problems. It created black markets and suppressed economic activity, but it did prevent rapid currency devaluation. Under pressure from the IMF and with support from the US, Argentina loosened those controls. Now the peso is allowed to float within a band, trading somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 per dollar. The idea was that this would attract foreign investment, restore market confidence, and help stabilize the currency through normal market forces. And indeed, in the short term, it seemed to work. Bond prices rallied. The peso temporarily regained ground. International investors seemed to regain some confidence in Argentina. But opening up the currency to market forces created new vulnerabilities. Capital, once restricted, could now flow out of Argentina if investors lost faith. Money could flee the country quickly, depleting the foreign currency reserves that the government was trying to rebuild. This is where the US stepped in. Using its Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, a tool with about $30 billion in liquid assets designed to intervene in currency markets and stabilize international financial systems, the US provided support to Argentina. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a powerful financial intervention, essentially signaling to global investors that Argentina had the backing of the world's largest economy. The message seemed to work. Markets stabilized, at least for the moment. The peso held its ground, but the underlying problems remained. The Argentina experiment: warnings for the world. Argentina is fascinating to study, but not in the way most people think. It's not a story of isolated foreign intrigue. It's a laboratory. It's a test case for what happens when a country adopts certain kinds of economic policies and what the real-world consequences are. Let's be clear about what's actually happening in Argentina. First, the social toll is devastating. You're not watching economic charts improve on a spreadsheet. You're watching real people, families who worked for years, built lives, raised children, suddenly unable to afford basic necessities. You're watching inequality widen as those with access to dollars survive and thrive, while those trapped in pesos fall further behind. You're watching the social fabric tear. Second, the austerity that's supposed to fix things is brittle. It works until it doesn't. When the next shock hits, a global downturn, a commodity price collapse, a geopolitical crisis, you'll see whether the discipline can hold. Argentina's experience suggests it often can't. When unemployment rises too far, when poverty becomes acute, when people feel desperate, political pressure builds. Governments fold, spending surges again, inflation reignites, and you're back where you started, only deeper in debt. Third, lifting currency controls exposed Argentina to a new danger: capital flight. Once you allow money to move freely, it can leave just as quickly. When investors lose confidence, and they will at some point, money rushes out. That drains the very reserves the government was trying to rebuild. It's a vicious cycle. Fourth, there's the debt problem. Argentina was already one of the world's most indebted nations before this bailout. Now you're piling US commitments and IMF obligations on top of existing debt to bondholders. By 2026, analysts worry that Argentina will face overlapping debt obligations to multiple creditors that exceed its ability to pay. History suggests that when that happens, something has to give. Either you default, or you return to your creditors asking for another bailout. And each time you go back to the well, you have less leverage. Fifth, there's the question of sovereignty. When a government becomes dependent on external financial support, decision-making power shifts. It's not always explicit, but governments that rely on external funding find themselves constrained. They can't pursue policies that anger their creditors. They can't spend on social programs if their lenders disapprove. They can't raise taxes on the wealthy if international investors balk. Over time, effective power drifts from democratically elected leaders to technocrats and foreign investors. Now here's the thing. Argentina isn't unique. And that's why paying attention to Argentina matters. When commentators say the United States is 2 years behind Argentina, they're not making a precise prediction. They're highlighting that America is exhibiting some of the same warning signs that preceded Argentina's crises: extremely high valuations in key asset markets, especially in sectors like technology, concentrated wealth and income, elevated leverage in parts of the financial system, policy uncertainty creating concerns about whether the operating environment remains stable. Look at the American stock market right now. Valuations are elevated, driven significantly by enthusiasm about artificial intelligence and expectations that major technology companies will generate massive returns. But here's the critical question. Are those stock prices based on realistic profit projections, or have they gotten ahead of themselves? If companies don't deliver the returns that markets are pricing in, stock valuations could fall quickly. And if they fall while leverage is high throughout the financial system, a correction could cascade into something more serious. Look at how foreign capital is behaving. For decades, the United States has been seen as the safest place in the world to invest. Money flowed in from everywhere. That capital inflow kept interest rates low and supported high asset prices. But in recent months, as the U.S. makes sudden policy shifts, imposes tariffs unexpectedly, and engages in institutional reshuffling, some international investors are becoming cautious. They're not withdrawing en masse, but they're shifting allocations to regions they perceive as more stable. If that trickle becomes a stream, if foreign capital really does start withdrawing from U.S. assets, interest rates will rise, asset prices will fall, and the dynamics that kept the system humming could unwind quickly. The International Monetary Fund has flagged these concerns in its Global Financial Stability Report. Valuations remain elevated. Systemic leverage creates vulnerabilities. High valuations combined with high leverage means that a shock to confidence, to earnings, to credit availability could trigger a cascade of problems. Leverage amplifies losses. When prices fall, leveraged investors are forced to sell to meet margin calls. That selling pressure drives prices down further. Other leveraged players panic and sell. Suddenly, normal market correction becomes a credit crisis. This is not scaremongering. This is what financial analysts see when they study the numbers. The human cost, when policy becomes personal. Zoom out for a moment and think about what's actually happening. In Iowa, a farmer is lying awake at 3 in the morning, doing math in his head. How much debt does he have? What's the payment? When is it due? What did his soybeans sell for today? Is that enough? Will the bank refinance? Can he hold on for another season? In rural Nebraska, a young woman who wanted to take over her family's farm is having second thoughts. She's watching her parents struggle. She's seeing no clear path to profitability. She's wondering if she should pursue a different career, leave the farm, move to the city where opportunities seem less bleak. Her family's agricultural legacy might end with her generation because the economics have become too punishing. In Wisconsin, a dairy farmer stands in his barn at dawn, looking at cows he's known for years, and makes a decision. He's going to sell the herd. He's going to exit the business. After decades, it's over. What will he do next? He doesn't know. He's in his 50s or 60s. He's skilled at dairy farming, but that skill doesn't transfer easily to other work. He'll probably take a job that pays far less, that doesn't use his expertise, that won't be as fulfilling. But it's better than going bankrupt. These aren't abstract economic stories. These are lives being disrupted, futures being altered, hopes being crushed. And all the while, $20 billion is being sent to Argentina. The contrast is almost incomprehensible to these farmers. They're asking a legitimate question. Why does a country on another continent get a massive bailout while we're told to be patient, that help is coming, that we need to wait for the trade war to work itself out? The official answer from Washington is that the Argentina support is about maintaining regional stability, about supporting a partner government, about strategic interests in the Western Hemisphere. Maybe there's truth to some of that, but from a farm kitchen in rural America, those explanations feel hollow. Because here's what farmers know: policies reflect priorities. Money goes where priorities lie. If $20 billion is being deployed for Argentina while American farmers receive promises and delays, then clearly American farmers are not the priority. That's the message farmers are receiving. That's the betrayal they feel. The structural vulnerability. But this story goes deeper than just one country or one agricultural crisis. It reveals something about how vulnerable American systems have become. Agriculture is supposed to be a strength. The United States has the world's most productive farmland, the most sophisticated agricultural technology, and the most efficient food production systems ever created. American agricultural exports have historically been a source of national wealth and global influence. When the U.S. had food surpluses, it could use those surpluses as leverage in international negotiations. It could feed allies, support development, project power. But that advantage disappears if the agricultural sector collapses. If family farms fail faster than new ones emerge. If young people abandon agriculture because they see no future in it. If production shrinks. If the skills and knowledge accumulated over generations are lost.